residential security maps were created. These were the maps that created red lines around areas that were supposed to be poor investments, bad bets for mortgage lenders, starving those pieces of the city, and creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that so frequently they would be the urban neighborhoods and districts that were targeted during urban redevelopment as slums and blight. Of course, they would continue to deteriorate if you would starve them of investment, as these policies did. Now, we know that the neighborhoods that are displaced during urban redevelopment projects have many different characteristics, but they are frequently poor people, people who are not well represented politically. They were often African Americans, and they're often the elderly people, poor elderly people who have nowhere else possibly to go within the city and have come to live in these older neighborhoods near the city center. One example of this is Bunker Hill in Los Angeles. These are two photographs from the 1950s by George Mann, which portrays exactly this kind of neighborhood. It would have been built up as one of the leading elite sort of Tony districts of town in the late 19th, early 20th century, as you can tell from some of the sort of grandiose Queen Anne Victorian style architecture, but had become a tenement district by the 20s and 30s, a place where there was affordable housing partly because the housing wasn't very well maintained, a part of the city that tolerated a tremendous amount of difference and diversity, including a place where the elderly could, what planners now call age in place, where you could stay where you were and age with grace and dignity and be around a supportive community. Bunker Hill, Los Angeles. Even from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, this neighborhood was sort of consigned to the past. It was a place where it was accessed through this funicular, Angel's Flight. Angel's Flight led to a world of yesterday. Romance dwells on picturesque Bunker Hill, but it was not part of the future of the city. It was part of the past of the city. And for those who wrote for these newspapers or had the mobility or desire to do so, it could be construed as a kind of romantic and picturesque place to experience the past. Bunker Hill in the 30s became a tableau for film noir and for noir literature. It became sort of the seedy, if you will, neighborhood close to the center of the city. Famously, Raymond Chandler wrote of Bunker Hill is Old Town, Lost Town, Shabby Town, Crook Town. Once, very long ago, it was the choice residential district of the city. And there are still standing a few of the jigsaw Gothic mansions with wide porches and walls covered with round-end shingles and full corner bay windows and spindled turrets, exactly those pictures I just showed you. They are all rooming houses now. Their parquet floors are scratched and worn through. In the tall rooms, haggard landladies bicker with shifty tenants. It became this sort of underbelly of the city, at least as it was being represented in film and literature. The film Crisscross is an outstanding noir film for you to check out if you want to see scenes of Bunker Hill from the 1940s and how the dereliction of the neighborhood was associated with moral failing in this place, where all kinds of criminality could occur. John Fante, the Los Angeles author, also spent his bohemian days in Bunker Hill. These were places, again, where you could be poor and you could live. So it attracted artists and bohemians like John Fante, who, in the 1940s, when the neighborhood is threatened by redevelopment even then, business leaders in Los Angeles had been trying to condemn and rebuild Bunker Hill for decades, at least since the 40s. He writes an encomium, a kind of romantic encomium, Goodbye, Bunker Hill. But Bunker Hill really comes under the into the sight of redevelopers, of city planners in the mid and late 1950s, when Bunker Hill is one of the first neighborhoods targeted by the Community Redevelopment Corporation of Los Angeles, which sort of picked up the baton from the Housing Authority of Los Angeles County. And there are two different representations of Bunker Hill I want to briefly describe to you. One of them is a propaganda film made in 1951 by the Los Angeles Housing Authority called And 10,000 More. And the second is a film made in 1956 called Bunker Hill. Both were made by students at the USC Film School, but both have very different attitudes towards Bunker Hill specifically in Kent Mackenzie's film, and the slum areas or blighted areas as the words they would themselves use in And 10,000 More. The conceit of And 10,000 More is the Housing Authority of Los Angeles wants to build 10,000 units of public housing. And the newspaper is alarmed. This seems like a big government intervention in housing. Did Los Angeles really need 10,000 units of housing? Could it possibly be that there were enough slums and blighted areas to justify that kind of investment? And so the newspaper editor sends out his reporter to explore the slums and blighted areas of Los Angeles, which he does. And he goes and he sees children playing in alleys unsupervised. He sees these sort of anti-modern conditions without electricity, and so on and so forth. It's a whole, it's really a 15-minute film, 10 minutes of which are sort of to scandalize the viewer that this something must be done. And he comes back to the editor of the newspaper and said, so, do we need 10,000 units? And the last line of the film is, brother, and 10,000 more. It's that bad in Los Angeles. To be able to identify and clear these slums would be a big priority. But in Bunker Hill 1956, and I should say that film from 51 was made by students at USC. In 56, a thesis project in the same program by the filmmaker Kent Mackenzie creates a much more sensitive and nuanced portrait of a number of people living on the hill, living on Bunker Hill. They are, his characters are mostly elderly people who are finding their own sustaining community within Bunker Hill itself. These are people who want to be part of the growing city. They don't want to be consigned to the past. They want to be part of the future of Los Angeles. They want to take part in the changing of Los Angeles, and they want to encourage urban redevelopment to a certain degree. They just don't think that their entire neighborhood should be condemned as one of the slums that was, well, not promoted, but warned against in the previous film. And it's a beautiful film that I encourage you to watch as you hear about, it's the elderly doctor taking care of the people in the neighborhood. I wish I had more film stills for you to show, but it's a wonderful representation of Bunker Hill in 1956. But despite that representation of Bunker Hill, the area is targeted by the Community Redevelopment Agency. It will be cleared to make way for a major redevelopment project adjacent to downtown. Kent Mackenzie in 1961 makes another film about Bunker Hill, this one called The Exiles, which is about Native Americans who had relocated to cities, including Los Angeles, in the 1940s and 50s, and exiles from their own native lands, and now exiled once again from Bunker Hill that's being targeted for redevelopment, another representation of the neighborhood from that time. So as this news is coming out about Bunker Hill, the people that are living there begin to object. Bunker Hill 1956 is itself a kind of counter-representation of this place, not as a slum, but as a sustaining community. The artist Leo Politi, who also lived on the hill, published a book of his beautiful drawings, illustrations, and text, Bunker Hill, Reminiscences of Bygone Days. And he writes at the end of the book, against urban renewal, he says, can we really call it progress when it means the extinction of our leading landmarks of town, historical, aesthetic, and sentimental values? By destroying all our islands of heritage, we are not only erasing the continuity of our city's history, but above all, we are denying our children the precious knowledge of the past. He was, again, objecting to the decision to redevelop Bunker Hill. And he produces, again, these drawings meant to dramatize the life of this place. Perhaps a little shabby or rough around the edges, but sustaining nonetheless. But plans for the redevelopment of Bunker Hill go forward despite these objections. And in 1960, the Historic American Building Survey comes to Bunker Hill to document the landscape in advance of its clearance. You often know that trouble's coming when the Historic American Building Survey comes to take pictures of your neighborhood, because they're often taking pictures of neighborhoods that we're about to lose. and a series of really, I think I have this one picture once, of fascinating photographs are taken. The one on the left I find especially interesting because it points out one of the great tensions Los Angeles was experiencing at that time. There's nowhere to park. The landscape is completely outmoded to service the dominant form of transportation technology of the post-war world. So here you have this old Victorian house that's not meant to be romantic. It's meant to be essentially rickety and out of date, and the cars are parking on the front. There's nowhere for them to go. Jack Boucher takes a series of these photographs of all of the landscapes that are about to be displaced. They're sort of photographs of decrepit Victoriana, if you will. It is the death knell for this neighborhood. Victorian architecture at this time is not sought after as it often is today. The Victorian architecture in the 1950s was seen as, again, the past, the shabby past, the outworn past that had to be cleared away. And clearance does ensue. Eventually, the old ghost mansions of Bunker Hill are giving way to progress. And even as the buildings are coming down, these Bunker Hill buildings are coming down, artists and even fashion impresarios are going to Bunker Hill to take fashion shoots. The houses fall, but styles live on. It's an indication of, even as we are losing these picturesque houses from the 19th century, they're still sought after as aesthetic from people who come from the outside, from artists who come from wherever they live, to visit these now disappearing houses of Bunker Hill. The actual actions of redevelopment here, as they are everywhere, are dramatic and traumatic. Some of the images that were taken showing here, especially, some of the old houses were carted away. Some of them were moved to a small heritage district on the side of the highway for some period of time. Dramatic clearance on Bunker Hill to make way for a suite of new buildings, which we can talk a little bit more about. It included buildings for banks, buildings for financial companies, and it included a new cultural acropolis with the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, and the same place in Los Angeles today where the Walt Disney Hall is and the Broad Museum is. This is Bunker Hill. These are redevelopment sites created by the clearance of Bunker Hill. And so today, in this new landscape, the new landscape of Bunker Hill has been completely remade as a series of these corporate peaks and meadows, if you will. It's its own strange, disorienting landscape of modern buildings and postmodern buildings amidst huge superblock areas that are not pedestrian friendly with lots of underground parking, a place where the Los Angeles urban rangers would explore these corporate peaks and meadows and see some of the new buildings of Bunker Hill, right? You see and some of these are designed by interesting architects. John Portman's Bonaventure Hotel, which became, for Frederick Jameson, in writing about postmodernity, he talks about the Bonaventure Hotel as being one of the emblematic spaces of the disorientation and placelessness of postmodern condition in late capitalism, as he puts it. Or Garrett Ekbo's garden here as part of one of these new corporate estates. A landscape of corporate estates is what replaced the neighborhood that was Bunker Hill. Now, you have to remember that at this time, the desire to rid cities of what were perceived to be slums was extremely powerful. The idea that demolition was progress was extremely persuasive. And the mayor of New Haven, Richard C. Lee, he is gleefully swinging the wrecking ball at the old Oak Street neighborhood in New Haven because he dreamt of a slumless city. And when he went to the Oak Street neighborhood, he was viscerally affected by what he perceived to be the dismal conditions of the people who had to live there. And documentary photography, not unlike the kind of propaganda of And 10,000 More, were furnished in order to help substantiate the claims that this area was a slum or that this area was a blighted area. Photographers would make surveys of these places. They would show almost always, again as a trope, children with nowhere to play, We needed modern playgrounds and new parks and open spaces within the city. Children shouldn't have to deal with these circumstances. It's meant to provoke your outrage, to make the argument that this is a slum that should be cleared. Or rickety fire traps, fire escapes in the back, and always the trope of the hanging laundry, which was itself thought of at that time as a kind of anti-modern device. You have to remember, this is the 50s and 60s. This is the birth of the suburban consumer age, where new washing machines and dryers are part of the modern household. Of course, today, hanging your laundry out to dry is sometimes a sign of sophistication, because to use a dryer these days is not such a good thing. But at that time, it was not considered a sign of sophistication. It was a sign of backwardness that needed to be cleared from the spaces of the city. Now, keep in mind, in terms of some of the deeper thought process behind this, the ideas around clearing out the cluttered, dense, dangerous, unhygienic, and morally corrupt spaces of the central city had been gestating for decades amongst modernist thinkers who wanted to remake the old city along new lines. Consider the work of Le Corbusier, who said, "We must kill the corridor street. The old street was completely unacceptable to the purposes of the modern city. We needed new, massive, new, limited access highways to come barreling into the city. Then convenient places to park where you could then elevate yourself into a new pedestrian-oriented forum." This was the image of the modern city, not mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented streets that we have now come back to value so much today. In 1942, Jose Luis Sert, who had come to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, wrote a book, Can Our City Survive? People were asking these questions. In fact, urban leaders in the late 40s and 50s had left for the suburbs, that industry and jobs had left for the suburbs. The central cities were in this paradoxical situation of both being too congested for it to be efficient, and yet also now increasingly losing its market share in so many ways. This was in the discourse at that time. Can our city survive? Is the central city threatened here? And Le Corbusier in 1925 had put forward dramatic proposals for remaking the center city. The sponsor of the Plan Voisin was an automobile company, you might suspect, who was very interested in hastening automobile-oriented circulation even within the old spaces of Paris. This is the left bank of this is the right bank of Paris, I believe, completely remade with a suite of Corbu's cruciform-shaped towers, a new city to replace the old, using the sort of then and now, or the current and future images to show the existing city as being totally inadequate for the modern age, and these kinds of landscapes, towers and parks, no light, no air, no open space. This was breeding ground, again, not only for disease, but also for crime, and this was the spatial and the social antidote to all of those problems. And so, when someone like Maurice Rotival creates a plan for New London, Connecticut, or for New Haven, Connecticut, he was an acolyte of Le Corbusier. He had studied with Le Corbusier. These ideas had been gestating in his own mind. And for New Haven, he produces a plan that looks very much like his own version of a Plan Voisin. Clear it all away. Take the entire quadrant, in this case, the southwest quadrant of the city, clear it of all of its existing buildings, create massive super blocks with winding picturesque ring roads and huge towers sitting in the middle of verdant lawns. You know, this was not a joke. This was a legitimate proposal. Rotival believed that this was necessary for the city to survive in the 20th century in his master planning diagrams here for New Haven. For Rotival and for the advocates of urban redevelopment, this was all part of a teleological, historical process that had to happen. It was just part of the natural development of the city, first oriented around its wharves, eventually oriented towards railroad. The automobile begins to play its role, and then 1940X to 19XX, what would you have? You would have airplanes, plastics, and television. In each case, they're giving you the transportation technology, communication technology, and the mode of production or some form of manufacturing. And so these kinds of proposals were a natural outgrowth of the progression of the city. And in New Haven, they succeed in executing some of these very dramatic plans to reshape the central city. One of the most notable being the Oak Street Connector, an urban highway that is brought right into the heart of the city of New Haven. All of the areas on its at its fringes also cleared to make way for a suite of new buildings, the new program of urban renewal. And I'll talk a little bit more briefly about these buildings. And the great leader, Richard C. Lee, standing over his model like the great kind of master of this domain, now very proudly able to celebrate the arrival of his new highway. Some of the early buildings around the Oak Street Connector, this connector highway, were not considered very distinguished architecturally, but they say a lot about the program or the power, the patronage behind the new buildings of the renewal landscape. Places like the Southern New England Telephone Company building that decided to build a huge building right on the connector itself. Or Madison and University Towers, that was not overtly, but very strongly advocated by and ultimately used by Yale and Yale faculty as a place to provide middle-class housing back in the center of the city itself. If cities were losing the middle class to the suburbs, we needed modern, high-rise, sophisticated apartments within the city in order to draw them back in. And there were some relatively interesting designs amongst them as well. For example, Crown Towers was designed by Cloethiel Woodard Smith, the Washington, D.C. architect who designed a number of architecturally interesting urban redevelopment projects along the same lines. Sophisticated living, new standards of apartment luxury built over what had been the Oak Street neighborhood, deemed a slum, condemned, and cleared. And these landscapes are still with us in New Haven. These are Madison York Towers. This is Cloethiel Woodard Smith's ensemble at Crown Towers. This is the Air Rights Garage, one of the monumental garage structures also built as part of urban redevelopment, as part of the Oak Street Connector. One of the most interesting things, is a bit of a digression, I think, in Cloethiel Woodard Smith's Crown Towers project was this parking facility. Again, parking is a huge preoccupation of the planners at this time. She designs these sort of delicate concrete shell carports, which maybe seemed a little bit off for the New Haven climate, but had weathered the storm and was serving its purpose still 50, 60 years after its making, until very recently they were torn down to make way for new housing on Crown Street. But I digress. When the highway comes to New Haven, it is for Dick Lee, it is a dream come true. It is the plug. It is the plug into this emerging network of highways. New Haven needed to find its own way to be a part of this new system, this new piece of infrastructure. And if you couldn't tap into that infrastructure, if you were bypassed by the highway, you would become a ghost town. Your city may not be able to survive. You needed to be a part of this emerging infrastructural system, which is why the Oak Street Connector, dramatized in this image, was so important to Dick Lee. It was right at the interchange of I-95, the Connecticut Turnpike, the same highway that's so important here in New London, and I-91, still being cleared here through Fairhaven, that would head up to Hartford and beyond. And so, the before and after, the old, dense, congested slum of Oak Street and the new landscape of urban renewal. I mean, in this image, the after is supposed to be better. The after is the preferable image here, just to clear that up, because to our eyes, many of us, including myself, we want to go back. We want to go back to this city. It looks much more interesting than this one. That this is a position of incredible privilege for me to say that I would like to go back to the decrepit areas of Oak Street as it was in the 1950s, but the idea of the continuous system of city streets, the idea of architectural and social diversity, these are values that our time has come 180 degrees back to appreciate once again. we want to rebuild the mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented city that was sacrificed so often during urban renewal. These two images, I think, dramatize it very clearly. These aerial photographs, you have the same you were just showing me of New London, and they're not dissimilar. Just to point out, you can see how the railroad is making the edge here. Railroads make the edge between land and water, and then the highway makes the edge between land and water and creates a new industrial redevelopment zone on Long Wharf here. I won't discuss that today. There's 91 heading up here, another big cloverleaf wiping out another small neighborhood in the Cedar Hill district, and so on and so forth. Again, for Dick Lee, it's a dream come true. Why? Because now New Haven could compete. It could compete with its own suburbs. It was losing market share to the suburbs. It was losing shoppers to the suburbs. There was an idea of an ideal shopper, an ideal consumer, a kind of lady consumer here. This white woman with a purse in one hand, with a shopping bag in another. It's a very eerie image of the same person replicated over and over and over again. If you've seen the film Stepford Wives, it might make you think of that a little bit. But there were so many places for her to shop from. There were all of these new regional shopping centers with plenty of parking. There was no problem. How could New Haven compete with its suburban competitors for this ideal shopper? Well, you needed the pulling power of almost 10,000 parking spaces. Again, parking. All the time parking. You could pull these people right into New Haven if you could build a glorious and large enough parking garage to satisfy them, which is what they did in New Haven. They built the Temple Street garage designed by Paul Rudolph, an epic concrete structure holding almost 10,000 cars. This is a heroic photograph of it from an impossible angle that you would never actually experience the building from, but one that accentuates its massive scale and really the image of modernity that it expressed. You know, this kind of architecture has become controversial. Not everyone likes, I mean, your own library is in the same mode of architectural thought in terms of exposed concrete brutalism, for example. And Rudolph was really one of the masters of this type. But it was meant to indicate the future. It was meant to indicate the transparency and progressiveness of the public realm, which was building these parking garages. This is a municipal parking garage built by the city of New Haven. And there's Paul Rudolph sitting with his Jaguar, sitting at the top of it, sort of promoting his new architecture as a kind of lifestyle piece, if you will. Now, the rest of the buildings built in what was officially known as the Church Street redevelopment project were not as exciting as the garage itself. They built Mally's department store and Macy's beyond it. The department stores had originally been facing the New Haven Green around the corner there. I'm sorry, I'm not illustrating it well. But now these big boxes by the side of the highway that were meant to be accessed from the parking garage itself. Now today, actually, these department stores have themselves been taken down because this shopping solution for New Haven, at least, was not successful. New Haven should not have tried to compete with its own suburbs on their terms to build a suburban-style shopping mall in the middle of the city, and these department stores ultimately fail. They're torn down. The land is fallow for another 10 years until the Gateway Community College was built on the same site. Yet we still have the Rudolph Garage. Here are some less than heroic images. I invite you to visit New Haven and go to the garage. You really should when you visit New Haven to make pilgrimage. And you can decide for yourself whether you find it inspiring or overbearing. I personally find it to be totally awe-inspiring, despite what I know was displaced to make way for this building. It is still, to me, quite a kind of an achievement. Indeed, in New Haven, there's a number of these extremely robust designs at the scale of the highway. Consider the Knights of Columbus building, which is the Catholic Fraternal Order and Insurance Company, and the New Haven Veterans Memorial Coliseum. This built by a private entity, the Knights of Columbus. This built by the city of New Haven as its civic arena. And you can see from this image that if you were going to build at the side of a highway, this would be about the scale to build it at. The tower accentuates its object status, right? You know, these modernist skyscrapers want to be visible from all four sides. They want to make their own context. It doesn't even pay attention to the street. It turns its back from Church Street and twists itself towards the connector itself to sort of to flaunt its highway-oriented design. But again, from the ground, and in the 1970s, these landscapes were looking a little bit more tawdry. Here's the unkempt streets leading up to the Coliseum and the Knights of Columbus building. The Coliseum was a very important piece of New Haven's cultural infrastructure for some time, even if it was this kind of strange, looming, and foreboding presence. You know, for those who were hockey fans, the Coliseum was very important. For those who went to rock and roll shows or to hip hop shows, it was a very important venue. And yet, by the 21st century, planners wanted to take the Coliseum down. It was no longer serving its original function. Hockey had left New Haven, and it was going to become difficult to sustain, despite efforts to save the Coliseum, despite work from some of my colleagues at the School of Architecture to show how it might be adapted and reused. The Coliseum was now looming over the 9th Square district of New Haven, which was meant to be New Haven's gentrifying, preservation-based loft living neighborhood, and so it was taken down. And now there's a surface parking lot there where you can enjoy parking today, because parking is joyful while we build for tomorrow. And when we build for tomorrow, what will we build? The same kind of diverse, mixed-use street that we tore down to make way for the Coliseum in the first place. Actually, this is one of the more recent renderings, although the future of the site is still very much in flux. I worked with some of my students a few years ago to create what we called historical wayfinding signage around the Oak Street connector, a series of signs that went back to the archives and brought forth ideas and voices from the past and distributed them around the space of the connector itself. For example, right facing the Oak Street connector, not every structure in this area is substandard. This is from New Haven Redevelopment Agency Propaganda 1955. Not every structure in this area is substandard, but like cutting a rotten spot from an apple, some of the good has to be cut away to save the whole. This was very much the logic of the redevelopment planners. You had to execute a comprehensive plan, and even if some of the pieces were still in good condition, it would threaten the viability of the larger project and had to go. One voice that came from the New Haven Oral History Project said, it was a sacred spot, a world, a universe. Now looking out onto the space of the highway. Now, in New Haven, as I tried to indicate, we've now come back from this assumption that the spatial paradigms of the 50s and 60s were the right way to go. And we are now slowly trying to re-stitch the city together across the space of the connector that had split apart the Hill neighborhood from downtown. And we built new bike lanes and even one new impressive office building that is meant to bridge over the space of the connector, and there are plans for more parcels and more building sites. And so this sign had its new context. New Haven is the greatest success story in the history of the world. That is what Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz said in 1964, now recontextualized to what many of us hope will be a more vibrant life for the Oak Street connector. Now, I've suggested that people like Kent McKenzie in his film Bunker Hill, 1956, were more sensitive to the actual social life of the neighborhoods that were condemned as slums and cleared. And there were others who began to publish influential works that would bring the same message to a broader public. For example, In The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jane Jacobs rails against the logic of the urban renewal planners and their clearance mentality. And she comes back with an appreciation of the everyday spaces of the mixed-use street as she composes a kind of ballet of Hudson Street and all of the activities there. And Herbert Gans, the sociologist, in his ethnography of the West End in Boston, which was Boston's Oak Street, perhaps, if you will. It was Boston's early experiment in clearance-style urban renewal. He would explain to his readers that although the West End might have been a relatively poor part of town and an underserved part of town, it was a sustaining community that probably did not warrant the wholesale clearance that it went through. And others would continue. The social psychologist Mark Freed would write about grieving for a lost home, about the social psychological trauma of displacement, about the difficulties that so many of the redevelopment agencies had in adequately rehousing the people that were displaced, all of the social fallout of these very dramatic, really violent actions of urban redevelopment. And so by the mid-1960s, cities like New Haven and others are beginning to adapt a new attitude towards urban redevelopment, one that did not emphasize strict clearance, but was more open to rehabilitation and preservation-based urban renewal. The Worcester Square project in New Haven is another example. Has anyone been to Worcester Square, been to New Haven here? Okay, a few of you had. Definitely worth a field trip. You can see that in Worcester Square, there would be a new school, a new modern school designed by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, and the highway is right behind it here. But the old Italianate mansions would be rendered in equal clarity. They too, rehabilitating these structures, were part of the urban renewal plan. Court Street, these old row houses that had become rooming houses and were housing all kinds of different people, were also restored as part of urban redevelopment. But it raises one central and confounding, one very difficult point about preservation-based renewal and about a critique of preservation more broadly. You could preserve the buildings, but you couldn't preserve the people very often. The people who were there, they had to go. New owners would come in, these urban pioneers, if you will, these gentrifiers, to buy up these rehabilitated houses as part of urban renewal and repopulate them in the guise of a nuclear family. In fact, the suburban ideal, if you will, of the perfect nuclear family is also still the social structure that redevelopment planners are propagating or are advancing with this urban renewal plan, but with a now increased sensitivity and sophistication to preservation and rehabilitation. Do you see what I'm saying here? Did you have a question, actually?
Yeah, so would they be like priced out of the neighborhood by the property value changes, or would they be forcibly removed?
It was a little bit of both. The buildings were acquired by the city just as any other clearance project would involve the condemnation and acquisition by the city, but instead of being clear, and the people left and were forced to leave, I suppose that's right, then they were rehabbed and marketed as townhouses, where you could actually have, you could live with your family on top, and then there were garden apartments on the bottom that you could rent. Now, I don't mean to malign this environment. It would be very possible to live there very happily, and I don't mean to say that the people that did come to live there in the late 60s and 70s weren't a diverse group of people. There's some evidence that they were a diverse group of people over time. Diverse by actually race and ethnicity, perhaps more than by income. But there were forms of community and diversity that were fostered there. I just want to add a complication here when we think about preservation. Whether we're preserving the buildings or whether we're preserving the right of the people who have lived there to remain. It can be very hard to balance them. Consider Jane Jacobs' neighborhood of the West Village. Much of the West Village was preserved. The Jane Jacobs ideal of the urban ballet was preserved, but what happens to the West Village? It becomes one of the most sought after, one of the most expensive places in the city, And you see urban change there, not by the clearance of urban renewal, but by the slow pattern of gentrification and investment. So the displacement might happen a little bit more slowly and along different logics, but perhaps I'll put forward, perhaps with similar social results. You know, Rhetoric had imagined this for Worcester Square. Of course, he wanted to rip the whole thing out. He wanted to bring the railroad in with these huge new industrial districts. It didn't work out that way. They went with the more preservation-based image. And I want to put these two renderings up for you. Actually, how would you analyze the differences between these two renderings? Both urban renewal projects. I've shown you the garage, Rudolph's garage, and now here's Worcester Square redevelopment. How would you analyze the differences here? Go ahead. Yeah, please.
I feel like the one on the right is much more open, and it seems more vibrant. The one on the left is more imposing.
Yeah.
Intense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please.
The one on the right definitely has like a lot more green space.
More what space?
Like
Green space, yeah.
In general.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really see it in the one on the left at all.
That's true. Definitely.
I just want to spread out. It's very together.
Yes, definitely. And what else in terms of the, yeah, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, the one on the left makes a point of completely erasing everything except for the building that it wants to focus on, whereas the one on the right is a more cohesive plan for the whole community there.
Yes, yes. All of you have made very good points, and what you said, I think, is really crucial. The only thing in this rendering is the brand new highway and the epic new garage. The rest of the city fades to white. But in the Worcester Square redevelopment program, the historic buildings are rendered with equal resolution. They come forward just as the Conte School itself does. And I put these forward to reflect on the shift in urban redevelopment logic from the heroic and the modernist to the rehabilitative and the preservation-based. There were other places where this was experimented with. I'm not going to talk about this in very much depth, but Old Sacramento became a preserved little historic district. You can see they took the highway and they just weave it right around this little historic area. I love this image because this is the historic area, so like, what's everything else? Chopped liver? I mean, this is like nothing going. This is the historic area, and there were a lot of old buildings there from the Gold Rush days, and they turned it into a kind of Disney World theme park, essentially, of the city as it was in the past. And there's some funny articles about it because this had become the sort of Skid Row. So it's the same logic here. We're going to displace the Skid Row people and bring in basically suburban shoppers that want to walk around a Gold Rush town because they can't get all the way to Disneyland, right? That's my critique. The Lucky Bottle Shop in the heart of Skid Row doesn't exactly cater to the champagne set. Some people drink straight out of the bottle, and there's no bronze plaques here by historical societies. In other words, this is the part of Old Sacramento that we're, get rid of it. We don't forget about that. Lots of people nearby are excited about historic Sacramento, all except the unworried customers who daily flow in and out of the Lucky Bottle Shop at the southwest corner of 2nd and J. Which, by the way, for you journalists, is a very elegant way to close your piece, to return to your lead and kind of wrap it up in this very elegant way. But this becomes part of a broader logic of downtown shopping. Those department stores that New Haven built, they didn't work. Why would you drive to New Haven? I mean, as great as it is to park in the Rudolph garage, and it is fun, don't bring your SUV. It's antique. The scale of it is antique. You gotta have a low car to get in there. It's very low clearance. And it really is amazing to park there, and an incredible privilege to do so. But there was nothing so great about shopping in the department stores next door. But if you could preserve the old Quincy Market and Faneuil Hall and turn that into a shopping mall, well, that was really going to bring in the tourists. That was really going to be exciting. This was at the end of the 1970s where the developer, James Rouse, was saying, hey, cities are fun. Cities aren't those old, dirty, messy slums with all of the problems we had in the 60s with civil rights, with riots, with uprising, with protests, all of the issues of the 60s, all of the economic malaise of the 70s. No. Cities are fun. You got to come back based on this historic-based, this preservation-based form of redevelopment, the festival marketplace. And of course in Boston, they already had a sensitivity to the past through the Freedom Trail, which was in place already in the 1950s actually. A way of stitching together a kind of mythological history of the founding, the cradle of liberty, and the founding of the United States and the revolution itself through the spaces of the city. I'm nearing the end here. I just want to point out some of the propaganda around this as well, around the Freedom Trail. It's actually available through the Boston Public Library online. This comic book created by the Chamber of Commerce, book won America's Heritage Along the Freedom Trail. And they're really excited. Now, they're at a place that looks a lot like the Prudential Center. They're basically at the Prudential Center. I mean, it doesn't work in terms of the actual geography, but because I study the Prudential Center, it looks like it to me, although the Prudential Center has staggered windows, and anyway. So they're excited. They're going to walk from the 20th century back to the 17th century, where America's freedom was born. It'll be like walking into a time machine, and they do. They walk through time. You know, she's very impressed. Isn't it wonderful how Boston has managed to preserve so many of its historic places, along with all the new buildings, expressways, and new housing? That's why Boston is known as both the cradle of liberty and the all-America city of opportunity. You could have it both ways. The old bookstore, eventually the mayor shows up. Anyway, they have this wonderful trip through the whole thing. And then they get to the part of the Tea Party here. I just want to point this out to you because I think it's so interesting and humorous. They say, our forefathers, while willing to pay their fair share for good government, revolted against excessive taxation at the famous Boston Tea Party, which is an oversimplification of the reality. They got mad enough to dump the king's tea overboard. People will always be upset about taxes. That's right. Like the husband chimes in, that's right. Like our ancestors, Bostonians today know, good government means lower taxes. Well, this is the Chamber of Commerce. So they're using history here to promote their own little bit of propaganda in their own interest. I just love that. You know, Boston is a place, and I'm going to close with this, because one of the themes I'm trying to get at here is, you know, who gets remembered, who gets to stay, whose history is celebrated, whose history is marked. These are all issues that are raised when we think about the kind of clearance and rebuilding or rehabilitation of the urban redevelopment period, and still today. You know, Boston was very early in creating a Black Heritage Trail, of charting a kind of alternative geography, a marginal geography perhaps, through the spaces of Beacon Hill, and it's a wonderful way to experience that part of the city. Washington, D.C. has an incredibly successful, in my opinion, African American Heritage Trail, where these histories are being brought to the surface in these cities. And in New Haven, the Ethnic Heritage Center is also doing its best to create these cultural heritage tours through the spaces of the city. And in the Ninth Square redevelopment area, which is the area that had been under the shadow of the Coliseum, its redevelopment in the 80s was also a preservation-based redevelopment where the new interventions, look at this rendering, you can't even see what's new here. At least in Worcester Square, you could tell that there was a new Conte school. Where are the new buildings? That one, there's a couple, but it's very powerful. Well, State Street has been altered dramatically, but that's a different story. And in this area, there's a path of stars. One is Ezekiel Scott, resident grocer of African descent. Ezekiel was one of New Haven's first grocers, and so on and so forth. So I want to leave with that kind of provocation for you. How do we choose to remember these moments in urban change where there is shifts in population, and how can we honor these diverse histories and bring as many to the surface as we can? So with that, I'll thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, sure. Are there any other questions? I'd be happy to clear anything up. I know I probably ranged quickly over some key things, so if there's anything, any question would be appropriate. Anyone? Yeah, please.
So I have a question. You started out by saying that the small cities like New London usually are representative of the urban renewal era, and they're representative of what usually happens to people and the cities themselves. And then at some point you mentioned that if the highway goes through the city, is kind of a way to bring prosperity, to bring progress to the city. So how does that, I understand how that can work with the big large cities like New Haven, but how about the small cities? Was that the same rhetoric, saying that the highway would bring prosperity and would bring more people rather than divide it?
I mean, you put your finger on a very difficult tension. I would say absolutely small cities like New London, and in this case New London and Groton, and I was learning from our students today about the importance of Groton and getting access to having access to that area. It would have been important for New London to have highway access. No major city wanted to be cut out of this new network. And you're right, it was meant to bring progress or to ensure economic viability going forward. And yet it required the sacrifice of whatever land uses, whatever people were in the way of what the Connecticut DOT decided was the best route for these on-ramps and off-ramps. And I gotta tell you, I mean, you look at the history of highway building, every little off-ramp you see in built-up areas is a whole world right there. The scale of the highway is at so much bigger scale than the small patterning of daily life. And I encourage you to look back at the fire insurance maps, the Sanborn maps, and look at them underneath the highway just to see what had been there. It would be really quite fascinating and to chart all of that. But that was the sacrifice in some sense. These were the sacrificial neighborhoods, and they were very often neighborhoods that had already been marginalized. One quick point about that, whenever they could, they would often try to get highways to follow the railroad. Now in New London, they didn't do that. You have your beautiful railroad right along the water. In New Haven, they did, as I showed you with Long Wharf. But the railroad in the previous era of city building had also marginalized communities and divided cities in different ways, and often highways accentuated and doubled down on divisions that had already been in place, but taking it to the next scale. When possible, many planners did try to follow already existing lines of infrastructure to where they were trying to go. But the scale of demolition, and I know there'll be a team here working on that, the scale of demolition is really hard to fathom, actually. And it was incredibly widespread during this period. And that's right, New London was in some sense more typical because there were many, many small and middle-sized cities that were going through the same process, even if, and I fall in this too, even if Boston, Los Angeles, New York, and New Haven becomes exceptional as well, because New Haven becomes known for being the city that was relatively small but had the most urban redevelopment money per capita. And they proudly wanted to be the model city. And so Renewal really did a job on New Haven. It's been a huge trauma that the city is still, in many ways, recovering from. Other questions or comments or thoughts? Yeah.
Do you think it's fair to say that sort of the suburbanite consumer wave outpowered any efforts of environmental stewardship or sustainability within